Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 40. Grass is Greener. A few weeks before Christmas, Frankie rang. He'd got the distinct feeling that Martin's heart wasn't in it anymore. He wanted to know if he was still up for it. If not, Frankie would have to start looking round for a replacement. Martin said he was unsure, but maybe they could have a chat about it. Frankie turned up at Martin's flat on Christmas Eve. Martin was strangely nervous. He and Frankie were almost good friends, as near as you can get to it in the music business. "So are you in or out, Martin?" "Oh, sorry, I'm out. It's just not fun anymore. Hasn't been for some time." "That's a shame, but thanks for your honesty." Frankie drove away to his Christmas Eve, leaving Martin to come to terms with what had just happened. He was determined not to nosedive into a deep gloom. He remembered some of the downfalls and defeats he'd survived. There'd been tougher times. He was going to miss the people, that was for sure. But he knew being on tour was not good for him in the end, in the long run. Too much of a good thing is not good for anyone. Martin wasn't certain if it was a good thing, but it was definitely too much. George had a New Year's Eve party. Martin was invited. A brazier glowed on the patio, and a little way down the garden the barbecue sizzled. There were lots of people Martin knew in the living room. Everyone wanted to know how the music was going, where he'd played. He said he was taking a break for a while. It saved difficult explanations. Marilyn was there. They laughed about that first night with the bong. Martin was glad they'd stayed friends. She'd steered him towards Germany all those years ago. He'd come to a dead end in England. Now they could look back and laugh. She was doing well. Martin felt he'd done well too, but in some ways he'd reached another dead end now. Marilyn said he'd started all over again back then. He could do it again. It gave him food for thought. Martin thought about Emma. They still sent each other emails about once a month, and every now and then they'd speak on the phone. She was always positive and encouraging when Martin talked about what he wanted to do. She often sent him photos, weekend outings and holidays. Slovenia was so beautiful. All those mountains, rivers and forests. All those beautiful old river valley villages. Martin had gritted his teeth after leaving the band and gone back to teaching. He would have done anyway during the gap in the gig calendar. This time there was no end in sight when he could disappear into a tour bus again. The work he'd got was further afield now. He was driving an hour each way most days to get there and back. The teaching was tedious. They were mostly long days. He needed the money, but it was soul-destroying. So grey and cold after the warm, colourful life on tour. He'd written 2 songs about Emma, or at least inspired by her. He kept his hand in recording songs at home. He still didn't like the sound of his own voice, but he liked some of the songs. So did Emma when he sent her a CD. Somehow things came to a head during one of his regular phone calls with Emma. There was a little serendipity at work too. Martin told her teaching was just the same old, but Emma had some good news. "You know what's happened, Martin? I can't believe it's true. My auntie died last year. I just found out I get the house. Isn't that amazing?" "Wow, Emma, that is brilliant. I mean, I'm sorry to hear about your aunt, but I'm sure she'll be happy for you." "Martin, it's such a lovely old farmhouse. but it's much too big for just me. I need someone to help. The garden's like a jungle." "Are you going to live there then?" "Yes, I give up my flat in Ljubljana." "I'd love to see it." "Why don't you come over, Martin? Have a little holiday." "I'll think about that, Emma." Martin didn't have to think for very long. He took a week off work and booked a flight to Slovenia. Emma picked him up at the airport. She still had her city flat, so he stayed there. Emma drove him out to the countryside to see her aunt's house. Martin loved it. Just the kind of house in the country he'd always dreamed of, but there was a lot of work to be done. It would take a tractor to tame the garden to start with, but he fell in love with it. They went to a restaurant for dinner on his last evening. They had minestrone, barley and bacon stew, and nut roll. Emma was fired up with red wine. "So you like the house?" "I love it, Emma. I want to live there." "You could." "What do you mean, Emma?" "Martin, it's much too big for me. I could never do all the painting and the mending and the gardening by myself. You could help me. You could live there and help me." "Are you serious? It's not just the wine talking, is it?" "No, seriously, Martin, I think it would work. But we have to agree on a couple of things." "Like what?" "We just live in the same house. We are not together. We are just friends." "Okay, I know." "You promise it stays like that?" "Yeah, okay, Emma." "You can live there for free for a while. You help me make the house and the garden nice again. When you get a job, you can pay your share of the bills." "That's fine, Emma. But do you really want me living in your house?" "I think we get on well enough for it to work. We can try it." Martin went back to Germany with his head spinning. This was his chance to get out of the hamster wheel he was trapped in. He still had a bit of money left. It would pay for the move and leave a little bit in reserve. He could start a new life in a new country. He'd be with Emma. He could live with being just good friends. The more he thought about it, the more it made sense. He could make another big move before he got too old. At least he could give it a try for a year or so. The alternative was to go on with the endless daily grind. He couldn't face it. It was time to move on. He gave a month's notice at work. His landlord agreed on the same for the flat. Martin began dismantling his home studio and packing all his things into boxes. He cast his mind back to when he gave up his country cottage. It was an enormous wrench. This felt pretty drastic too. He'd been in the flat too long anyway, and maybe he'd been just long enough in Germany. Slovenia was going to be different. Martin looked forward to everything that would be new. He'd have to learn some Slovene. They say once you've conquered a second language, the others are easier to learn. At least he knew what to expect, being a beginner again. It was a long way to Slovenia. Martin set off very early. After checking round the flat one last time, he posted the keys through the letterbox and got into the rental van. He drove south all the way down through Germany and across Austria. He reached the Slovenian border early evening. The checkpoint was set in thick, hilly forest with winding mountain roads and snow-capped peaks in the distance. The border police were friendly and waved Martin through. Martin stopped at a roadside cafe a few miles further on. He'd been driving for 10 hours now. It was a little log cabin with garden tables set out in front. The view was fabulous. Martin soaked up the green and drank the fresh air. The coffee was good too. He lit a cigarette and thought how amazing this was. Something inside him had said it was the right thing to do. He said a little prayer that it really was. In another 2 hours, he'd be at Emma's, maybe a bit sooner. Martin hoped she'd got the dinner on and a couple of bottles of red handy. Martin used to hate gardening. It was his least favourite chore as a kid. Sitting on the stone steps down from the terrace, he looked out over the grass with a sense of pride. With the help of one of those heavy, old-fashioned cast-iron push rollers, it was now almost perfectly flat. The grass was fine enough and short enough to merit the word lawn. All it needed was a little rain and regular raking, and it would soon be worthy of a glossy magazine. It was bordered along its length on one side by a thick hedge. Down the other, the old stone wall that jutted out from the corner of the house sheltered the garden from the elements. In the far corner, at the bottom, stood several very old apple trees and an enormous 50-year-old cherry tree. Piled against the stone wall, halfway down, there was a rockery. In front of that was the oval pond Martin had dug, planted with aquatics and water lilies. Several noisy frogs had now made it their domicile. Built onto the garden wall in the corner where it joined the house was a glass greenhouse. It was crammed with tomatoes, peppers and cucumbers. Next to it was a large vegetable patch with a raised wooden-framed herb garden where the 2 cats liked to doze. The house itself was stone-built, originally a farmhouse. The low-ceilinged kitchen still had the original pavement-paved floor, but a modern wood-fired range. There was a huge open fireplace in the living room, enough bedrooms upstairs for a sizable family, and 2 modern bathrooms. It had a large cellar comprising several rooms. With Emma's approval, Martin had converted the largest room into his studio. It had a full drum kit already set up at one end. He still had some work to do with carpeting, sound deadening and wiring. The smaller neighbouring room would be the control room. He knocked a hole in the dividing wall for a soundproof window. When this was installed, he could put in his mixing desk and his tape machine. His first real studio. Martin had made the move to Slovenia in March, the same month he'd moved to Germany. But this was the best move he had ever made. Emma was really happy too. He'd been there about 6 months now. The garden was looking beautiful. The studio was coming on nicely. Martin hoped to have it finished by around Christmas. He had a lovely big bedroom next to the guest bathroom at the back of the house, overlooking the garden. Emma had the main bathroom and the 2 bedrooms at the front, which had a connecting door between, making a kind of suite. Emma had quite a high-powered job as a business consultant, working for a firm in the nearby capital. Martin had found some work teaching kids English at the local kindergarten part-time, which he really enjoyed. It was more than enough to cover his share of the food and bills. He hoped to earn a bit more teaching guitar when he'd finished building the studio. Emma liked to paint in her spare time. Martin secretly hoped she might design his album covers one day. He was steadily collecting songs. One of the 2 cats had got pregnant recently, so kittens were on the way. There was room at the front of the house to build a chicken coop. It meant being woken too early by a cockerel, but having fresh eggs every day. The living room was still furnished with Emma's auntie's antiques. Alongside the oils and pastels of a bygone age, some of Emma's paintings hung on the walls. There were 2 enormous armchairs either side of the fireplace, which the cats were quick to colonise. The days started to get shorter. The soft September sun lit up the morning dew. It sparkled on the cobwebs on the wet grass, draping the lawn with a fine net of silver. Martin sat at the kitchen table, looking out of the old wood-framed window. What a lucky life he'd had! What a lucky man he was!